Hi folks, all right, I'm back for one last video clarifying some of the confusions that we often run into regarding utilitarianism. And this one's really more of a challenge than a confusion. One worry that we might have about utilitarianism is that it's just not possible, right? Is it even possible to calculate the long-term consequences or the overall consequences of each and every one of our actions? And if I have to sit back and think every time I'm about to do anything that might have an impact on anyone other than just me, if I have to sit back and think, how's this going to affect other people? How are they going to be, how are they going to either benefit from it or be harmed by it? Is the overall balance going to be pleasure rather than pain produced for others? How am I even supposed to figure that out? Uh, in uh, in many cases, many of the consequences are just opaque to me. Like I can't predict what they're going to be. I can't see that far into the future. I can't see that broadly. I can see or I can see the immediate effects on people who are right around me, who are immediately affected by my action, but I can't see the long-term effects of it. Say I unintentionally slight someone who just takes that as a personal insult and sulks over it for weeks, and as a result ends up losing their job, and their losing their job ends up harming their family, and their kids suffer as a result. Like, I couldn't have predicted that happening, but that's a consequence of my action. So how could I even begin predicting all of these consequences? I also don't have enough information in terms of in terms of how a lot of the things that I consume in my daily life have been produced. Um, this is, if anyone's watched The Good Place, this is one of the central premises of this show, is that the world has become so complex, so difficult to understand, and so intertwined that we can't often, or that we often can't even make a choice that doesn't inflict some harm in some way. We might inflict harm on the environment, inflict harm on other species, inflict harm on underpaid farm workers or factory workers by the consumption choices that we make, yet we might not have any better options. And so it's often just really difficult to do this calculus to figure out what it is that will actually create the greatest good for the greatest number. Jeremy Bentham, the founding father of utilitarianism, even tried to define this calculus. He called it the philosophic calculus, this calculus that would help us figure out which actions were tended to bring about the greatest good for the greatest number. And he said we ought to focus on the duration of the pleasure or pain, the intensity of the pleasure or pain, the propinquity of the pleasure or pain, that is, how near or remote it is to us, and we're more responsible for those that are near than that are more remote. The extent of it, how widely the pleasure or pain covers, the certainty of it, right? We couldn't be absolutely certain of all of the consequences of our actions, but we can be more certain about some than others, and that matters. That's what we're responsible for. And the purity of the pleasures that are created. How free from pain is this pleasure that is created? And factoring all of these things in, we should be able to come to some conclusion about which act to do. But I'm paralyzed, right? How could I possibly figure out in each moment how to act? How could I possibly go through this calculus for every action that I'm trying to perform? How do I know how to weigh the intensity versus the probability of the pleasure that's going to be brought about, or the happiness that's going to be brought about? This seems nigh impossible to me. And Mill recognized this and said, maybe that's not how we should think about this. Right? maybe that's not exactly how we should do utilitarianism. We shouldn't apply it to each act. That's Bentham's act utilitarianism. Rather, we should adopt some rules of thumb. We should adopt some general principles that when we abide by those principles, when we live by those principles, we have a tendency to bring about the greater good for the greater number. There may be some individual cases where it doesn't work out, but at least overall, we tend to bring about the greatest good for the greatest number by following these rules. And adopting these rules is good because it allows us to act in a way that is likely to bring about the greatest good for the greatest number. We won't paralyze ourselves in indecision. We will actually be able to act. This is Bentham's rule not Bentham's, this is Mill's rule utilitarianism. So we ought to adopt the rule that we won't harm another person in order to benefit ourselves, right? Even though in some instances it might lead to the greater good to harm someone in order to benefit ourselves. In general, it's better if we don't do that. We might adopt the rule that says you ought not to tell a lie. I won't lie, because in general, honesty leads to better outcomes than dishonesty does. And we can't figure out case by case which case it is. Now, there are different versions of rule utilitarianism. There are weak and strong versions. The strong version of rule utilitarianism says you just pick these rules and you always follow these rules. In fact, what justifies the set of rules is that they lead to the greatest good for the greatest number, but we can't tell for sure when deviating from those rules. We can never tell for sure when deviating from those rules is going to lead to a better outcome, so we just have to stick to the rules. It makes a distinction between the decision procedure for utilitarianism. The decision procedure is just following these rules, and the metaphysical account of what makes these rules good, right? It's not that, it's that it brings about the greatest good for the greatest number. A weak rule utilitarian, on the other hand, would say, well, these are rules of thumb, and sometimes you can deviate from these rules. You can deviate from them when the rules come into conflict, for example. When you're in a situation where two rules are conflicting with one another, then you ought to revert to the act utilitarian way of thinking. You ought to try to figure out which rule you should violate in order to bring about the greatest good for the greatest number. You must violate. So let's just take one quick example to tie this up. Right? A common example that distinguishes between act and rule utilitarianism is a thought experiment that says, suppose you're a doctor working in a hospital and you have 5 patients, each of whom is in desperate need of a different organ. And a healthy person comes into the hospital, relatively healthy person, like they're there for some blood work or something, and you happen to notice on their chart that they are a perfect donor for all 5 of your patients. Miracle. I have no idea how that happens, but that's what happens. The act utilitarian, it seems, would be committed to saying, well, you ought to kill that person in order to save the 5 others. Right? You could save 5 lives, and those lives, they could go on to flourish. Say they're children, right? They go on to live full, happy lives. And this poor schmuck who walked in the door, like, well, sorry, but it's just one life, and you're older and wouldn't make as much of it anyways, so we're going to give your organs to these kids. Well, that seems like a really problematic consequence of act utilitarianism. Rule utilitarian, on the other hand, is going to say, hold on, no, we have a general rule against killing someone in order to save someone else, or in order to save other people, killing an innocent person at least, in order to save other people. You shouldn't do that. And that rule is justified because it leads to the greatest good for the greatest number. If it weren't the case that we had such a rule in place, then no one would ever use the healthcare system, No one ever show up at the doctor's office if they thought, or at the hospital if they thought there was some chance, even a very small chance, that when they walked in there, the doctor would be like, "Ooh, I have a patient that needs your heart. They're going to do more with it than you will. So, head over to the operating room. We'll put you under. It's been a nice life." What? No, right? I would never go into the hospital if that were a possibility, and no one would. But since the healthcare system as a whole does so much good, we want to ensure that it is trusted, and we do so by adopting this kind of rule against those kinds of capricious actions. All right, so that wraps up our clarifications of utilitarianism for this week. Next week, we're going to look at arguments in support of utilitarianism. So we're going to get down into the weeds of utilitarianism.